My dad took his life on my 5th birthday. 3 years later, I found his handwritten letter. Mom told me it was an old goodbye note. But as I grew older, I started receiving frequent, oddly specific letters that made me question everything. In these letters, Dad would congratulate me on making it to my middle school graduation, for getting my driver's license. And on my 17th birthday, the letter mentioned Isla, my friend who I'd only met 2 months ago. I tried telling myself it was some kind of mistake, but deep down I knew something was up. I marched straight to my dad's best friend's house. They'd grown up in the same foster house, and if anyone would know the truth, it would be him. To what do I owe the pleasure? What is this? I interrupted him, holding up the letters that had been my family secret up until now. His face instantly drained of color. He didn't even read them, but somehow knew what they were. Your father. He knew you better than you think, he stammered before practically shoving me out the door. I couldn't stop thinking about it. So the next day after school, when I saw his car at the grocery store nearby, I waited around the corner. He came out of Aldi, except he wasn't carrying any groceries. Just an envelope. That's when I knew I had to follow him. I called an Uber instantly and told him to follow. 10 minutes later, I found myself at a storage unit on the edge of town, crouching behind a rusty container watching my dad's best friend work from afar. He was in that storage unit for so long that by the time he finally came out of it and drove away, I'd fully finished 2 Natasha Chamberlain podcast episodes. That's when I snuck in. The storage unit was still unlocked, probably because he was A, kinda dumb, and B, it hadn't expected a psycho beach to come snooping around. Inside the unit, boxes lined every wall. I opened the closest one and nearly dropped it. Hundreds of letters instantly spilled out, and these were all addressed to different girls. Natasha, Paige, Chloe, all written like they were from dead fathers. Then I spotted one that made my blood freeze. For Sophie, my name, 18th birthday. That was 3 weeks away. My fingers trembled as I opened it. It started off with normal, proud father stuff. Then, soon we can finally be together again. Follow the instructions. I started freaking out. He was actually planning to lure me somewhere. Where would he have taken me? And what would he do once we were alone? I was about to sneak out to just get some air until I saw the filing cabinet. Inside were folders filled with girls' photos. The photos didn't have names on them at first, but after reading the letters, I could match the physical appearance as described in the letters to their names. I pulled up Google and searched the names, and my blood went cold. Paige Wright, missing. Amanda Thompson, missing. All vanished right before turning 18. My 18th birthday was in 3 weeks. I grabbed everything I could carry and sped to Victor's house. You wrote these, I said, dumping the folders on his Kit Collins table. He didn't even deny it. Parents pay me to write them to grieving daughters who need comfort, but your mom never gave me a dime. His hands shook as he pulled out a ledger. Look at this, he said, showing me the payment records. Most parents only pay me for a year, maybe 2, but someone's been paying me monthly for 12 years to write to you. He showed me the pickup address where he collected his fee, Starfire Grief Center. I recognized it instantly. It was a therapy center I went to twice after Dad died. Wait, all these missing girls, did they go to Starfire too? He nodded, looking sick. They all disappeared right before their 18th birthdays. Except for one, Natasha Collins, aged 19. There was an address crossed out in red pen on her file, but I could still make out Leng Books. After driving over 20 miles, I found her working at a bookstore 2 towns over. Natasha Collins? I asked. She nodded, scanning the book. This is going to sound crazy, but did you used to get letters from your dead father? Her face went white. I don't know what you're talking about. She shoved my book back at me. I think you should leave. Wait, I pulled out one of my dad's letters, hands shaking. I get them too. Every birthday since I was 8. She looked around the empty store, then grabbed my arm. A week before my 18th birthday, I got one saying Dad was waiting for me at the old Starfire building. Said he'd faked his death to protect me. I was actually going to go, but my mom found it first and freaked out. My blood ran cold. I left immediately, driving home in a panic. That night, a letter slipped under my door. 3 weeks before my birthday. I opened it with shaking hands. My dearest Sophie, I've waited so long for this. Midnight on your 18th birthday. Come to the Starfire building. Come alone. I got ready to leave. Requested Reads is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. To leave to the police, but my hands froze on my phone. I couldn't just walk into a station and dump this on some random cop who might not believe me or might mess everything up. I needed someone who would actually listen and know what to do. I texted Jackson at 2 a.m. asking if he knew anyone in law enforcement we could trust, and he responded instantly saying the school resource officer was actually pretty cool and might point us in the right direction. I barely slept that night, just kept staring at the letter and thinking about Natasha almost going to that meeting. The next morning, I walked into school early and headed straight to the SRO's office before I could chicken out. She listened to my whole story for maybe 10 minutes, looking at the letters I brought, and then she picked up her phone without even asking if I was okay with it. She called someone named Barry and said she had a case he needed to hear about immediately. Within an hour, I was sitting in a coffee shop across from Detective Barry Holder, spreading letters and photos across the table between our drinks. He had kind eyes, but they got really serious when I explained about the missing girls and Victor and the 12 years of payments. He took notes on everything, asked detailed questions about exact dates and times, and promised this would stay between us until we had a solid plan. I felt this huge weight lift just having an actual detective believe me instead of thinking I was paranoid or crazy. 2 days later, Barry called and asked me to meet him at the same coffee shop. He pulled out his laptop and showed me security footage from the Aldi, and there was Victor walking out at exactly the time I remembered, carrying just an envelope and nothing else. Seeing it on screen made everything feel more real, like I wasn't making this up in my head. Barry said he was working on getting warrants but needed to build the case carefully, so nothing got thrown out later. That afternoon, I was sitting in chemistry class when my phone buzzed with an Instagram DM from an account with 0 posts and no profile picture. The message just said, "Stop asking questions," and my heart started pounding, so hard I thought everyone could hear it. I screenshot it immediately and sent it to both Barry and Jackson, my hands shaking so bad I almost dropped my phone. Barry called me during lunch and said he traced the account to a burner email address, but couldn't get much further without a subpoena. He told me the threat itself was actually evidence that we were getting close to something, which somehow made me feel both safer and more scared at the same time. That evening, Barry picked me up in an unmarked car and drove me past the Starfire building. It sat in this industrial area outside town with a bunch of empty lots around it, looking way less welcoming than the photos on their website. We parked down the block and just watched for over an hour. A few regular-looking people came out around 6 p.m., probably normal clients who had no idea what was really going on inside. Then at 8 p.m., when the place should have been closed for the night, someone went in through a side door that I hadn't even noticed before. Barry made notes in this little notebook and said he'd come back with better surveillance equipment to see who was coming and going after hours. The whole thing felt surreal, like I was in some crime show instead of my actual life. I couldn't stop thinking about Natasha and how close she came to going to a meeting just like the one they wanted me to attend. The next day after school, I drove the 20 miles back to Ling Books and found her on her break in the back room. This time when I approached her, she didn't try to brush me off. She pulled out her phone and showed me the exact letter she got before her 18th birthday, and I felt sick reading it because the wording was almost identical to mine. It even had the same phrase, "We can finally be together again," that made my skin crawl. She told me she spent the last year wondering if she was a coward for not going, if maybe her dad really could have been alive somehow. I looked her right in the eyes and told her she wasn't a coward. She was a survivor, and the information she was giving me might help save other girls from whatever happened to Paige and Amanda. We exchanged numbers right there, and she made me promise to text her every single day, so she'd know I was safe. I promised and meant it, because talking to her made me realize how easily I could have been one of the missing girls if I hadn't gotten suspicious about the letters. Barry called me 2 days later with news that made my stomach flip. He'd interviewed Victor again, this time at the actual police station instead of his house, and Victor started slipping up about the payment schedules. Victor mentioned getting paid, like clockwork, every month for over a decade, which proved the payments for my letters never stopped even after all these years. Barry said Victor was getting scared now and might be willing to cooperate more if we pushed the right way. The storage facility manager came through with access logs showing Victor visited that unit at least 3 times before every girl's 18th birthday going back 5 years. Barry spread the logs out on his desk and showed me the pattern, and it was so clear and deliberate that I felt physically sick looking at it. But Barry said patterns were exactly what he needed to get a warrant from a judge. By the end of that day, he called me back saying he had a judge's signature to search the entire storage unit. The police search happened on a Tuesday morning while I was supposed to be sitting in English class. Barry texted me updates every 20 minutes, and I sat in the school bathroom stall reading them and trying not to cry. They recovered boxes and boxes of letter templates organized by girl's name, mailing schedules written in Victor's actual handwriting, and photo files that matched the pictures of the missing girls I'd seen before. I sat there on that toilet reading Barry's texts and crying with relief that I wasn't making this whole thing up, that there was real evidence now that other people could see. When I finally came out of the bathroom, my eyes were all red and puffy, but I didn't even care. Barry introduced me to Rachel Bennett the next day at the police station. She had short gray hair and this calm voice that made me feel instantly safe, like she'd seen everything before and nothing shocked her. She worked as a victim advocate with the DA's office and specialized in cases like mine. Rachel explained all my options without pressuring me toward any specific choice, which I really appreciated because everyone else kept telling me what I should do. She gave me her cell number written on her business card and said I could call 24/7 if I ever felt unsafe or just needed to talk. Having that card in my pocket made me feel less alone. Rachel set up a safety workshop just for me in a private room at the Victim Services Center. She taught me de-escalation tactics for if someone tried to corner me, code words I could use in emergencies that would sound normal to anyone listening, and how to trust my gut instincts about dangerous situations. We practiced scenarios where someone tried to isolate me or pressure me into going somewhere alone, and she showed me different ways to get out of those situations safely. By the end of the 2-hour session, I felt way more prepared, like I had actual tools instead of just fear and panic. Rachel made me practice the code words until I could work them naturally into conversation, and she gave me a small personal alarm to keep on my keychain. The next afternoon, Jackson came over with his laptop and we spread out all the scanned letter copies on my bedroom floor. He pulled up some software that could analyze email headers and digital footprints, and we started feeding the scanned images through his system. About 20 minutes in, he stopped scrolling and pointed at his screen, showing me a bunch of code I didn't really understand. He explained that all the letters had been printed at the same copy shop, some place called Quick Print Solutions that was only 3 blocks from Starfire. We pulled up a map on my phone and marked both locations, and suddenly the whole operation looked way more organized than I'd thought. Everything was kept tight in the same neighborhood, probably so whoever was running this could move between locations easily without drawing attention. I took screenshots of everything and texted them to Barry with a note about the print shop connection. He replied back within minutes saying he'd add it to his investigation list and would check if Victor had any connection to that business too. 2 days later, my neighbor Mrs. Chen knocked on our door holding her phone. She told Mom she had something weird on her security camera from a couple nights ago and thought we should see it. I came downstairs and she showed us footage of a dark sedan sitting near our mailbox around 2 a.m., just idling there for almost 10 minutes before driving away slowly. The angle wasn't perfect, but you could make out part of the license plate in one frame when the car turned. My hands shook as I asked Mrs. Chen to send me the video file, and the second it hit my phone, I forwarded it straight to Barry. I paced around the kitchen for the next hour, checking my phone every 30 seconds until Barry finally called back. His voice sounded serious when he told me he'd run the partial plate through police databases and got a hit. The car was registered to someone who worked at Starfire, which meant they'd been watching my house and knew where I lived. I felt sick knowing someone had been outside my home in the middle of the night, probably checking to see if I was following their instructions. Barry called me in for a meeting at the police station a few days after that. When I got there, he walked me into a conference room where a woman in a suit was waiting, and he introduced her as the district attorney. She had all our evidence spread out on the table in organized folders, and I sat there while they went through everything piece by piece. Barry explained the storage unit findings, the letter patterns, the missing girls, Victor's cooperation, the car surveillance footage, and the print shop connection. The DA listened carefully and took notes, asking questions about timelines and evidence chains. After about an hour, she leaned back in her chair and said they had enough for a warrant on Starfire itself, which made my heart jump. But then she said something that made my stomach flip. She wanted to consider a controlled operation where I actually kept the midnight meeting on my birthday, with police backup positioned around the building. The idea of walking into that place knowing what I knew made me want to throw up, but Barry explained it might be the only way to catch whoever was behind this actually trying to grab me. He said with just the evidence we had now, they might only get conspiracy charges that wouldn't stick as well. But if they caught someone in the act of attempted kidnapping, the case would be way stronger. I sat there staring at the table trying to process what they were asking me to do. That night, I knew I had to tell Mom everything properly this time. I called Rachel and asked if she could come over to help mediate the conversation, because last time Mom and I talked about this, it went badly. Rachel agreed and showed up an hour later with her calm presence that always made me feel safer. We all sat in the living room and I walked Mom through every single piece of evidence slowly and carefully. I showed her the letters, the photos of missing girls, Victor's ledger, the surveillance footage, the print shop connection, everything organized in chronological order. I watched her face change as she looked through it all, her expression shifting from skeptical to confused to absolutely horrified. When I finished explaining about the controlled operation idea, she just sat there silent for a long moment. Then she started crying and apologized for not believing me earlier, for thinking I was being paranoid or dramatic. She grabbed my hands and asked what she could do to help keep me safe, and I felt this huge relief that she finally understood how serious and real this all was. A week later, Barry called saying a local reporter named Zoe Riggs had contacted him asking questions about the storage unit search. Apparently, she'd been monitoring public records requests and noticed the warrant filing. Barry wanted to know if I was okay with him talking to press, and we spent an hour on the phone discussing whether media attention would help or hurt. I talked to Rachel about it too, and we decided that getting some information out there might actually warn other girls who could be targets. Barry met with Zoe and gave her limited details that wouldn't mess up the investigation, and she agreed to hold back anything that could compromise what we were building. 3 days later, her article came out in the local paper with a headline about predatory grief counseling scams targeting young women. She didn't name me or give specific details about Starfire, but she laid out the general pattern of fake letters from dead relatives being used to lure vulnerable people. I read it online and felt this weird mix of exposure and validation, like finally someone outside our small circle was acknowledging this was real and dangerous. The morning after Zoe's article published, Jackson texted me a link to Starfire's website. I clicked it and saw a new banner across the top announcing a temporary closure for facility updates. My stomach dropped because the timing was way too convenient. I immediately called Barry and he said he was already on it, pulling phone records from Starfire's business lines. He called me back 2 hours later and told me there'd been a bunch of calls between Starfire numbers and Victor's phone right after the article went live. Barry said they were scrambling and panicking, which meant we were getting close to exposing the whole thing. But he also warned me that scared people do unpredictable stuff, so I needed to be extra careful about my safety. He told me to stick to public places, always tell someone where I was going, and call him immediately if anything felt off. That afternoon, my phone rang from a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up, and the voicemail that got left made my skin crawl. A woman's voice, smooth and caring, introduced herself as Alyssa Harrington from Starfire. She said she'd heard I might be interested in grief counseling services and wanted to offer me a private session at a special discounted rate. The way she talked sounded so kind and understanding, but knowing everything I knew made it feel gross and predatory. I saved the voicemail and drove straight to Barry's office, where Rachel was already waiting for another meeting. I played them the message and watched their faces get serious. Rachel said the language Alyssa used was way too similar to the patterns in the letters to be random, and Barry agreed the timing right after their closure announcement was suspicious. They both thought this was a direct attempt to make contact with me, now that their normal operation was falling apart. Rachel spent the next hour coaching me through making a recorded phone call back to Alyssa. She gave me a script of innocent questions to ask while listening for specific phrases that might connect to the letters. My hands were sweating, so bad I could barely hold my phone as I dialed the number from the voicemail. Alyssa answered on the second ring with that same smooth voice, and I tried to sound curious rather than terrified. I asked about her counseling approach and what kind of services she offered, and she talked about helping people reconnect with lost loved ones and finding closure. Then she used the exact phrase that had been in my lure letter, talking about how grief counseling could help me feel like my dad and I were together again. Barry was sitting across from me and gave me a thumbs up when he heard it, mouthing that I was doing great. I managed to finish the call without my voice shaking too much, thanking Alyssa and saying I'd think about scheduling something. The second I hung up, I felt like I needed to shower. Barry took the recording straight to the DA that same day, along with all our other evidence. I waited at home trying to distract myself with homework, but mostly just staring at my phone. Finally, around 8 p.m., Barry called and said the DA had agreed to greenlight the controlled meeting operation if we could make the safety plan completely solid. He explained what that meant in detail, that I would actually go to Starfire at midnight on my birthday, wearing a wire with police positioned all around the building and in unmarked cars. They'd have eyes on me the whole time and could move in within seconds if anything went wrong. My stomach was doing flips as he talked through the plan, but I knew this might be the only real chance to stop whoever was behind this, and maybe get answers about what happened to those missing girls. Barry said we'd do multiple practice runs and safety drills before my birthday, so I'd know exactly what to do in any situation. When I told Mom about the final decision to do the controlled operation, we had the biggest fight we'd ever had. She completely lost it, yelling that they should just arrest everyone now based on what we already had, and not put me in danger. I tried to explain what Barry had told me about how without catching someone actually trying to grab me, the charges might not stick, and these people could get away with it. Mom said she didn't care about charges sticking. She cared about me being safe, and nothing was worth risking my life. We went back and forth for over an hour, both of us crying and frustrated. Finally, I told her I was doing this with or without her permission because I was almost 18, and those other girls deserved justice. She looked at me for a long time and then said, if I was really going through with it, she was going to be in the command vehicle with Barry the whole time so she could see and hear everything that was happening. Barry agreed to that arrangement when I called him, and Mom made me promise I'd follow every single safety protocol exactly as instructed. I promised, even though the whole thing made me want to throw up every time I thought about it. The next morning, I went straight to Barry instead of doing anything stupid on my own. He met me at the police station and took me to a small room in the back where he pulled out what looked like a normal jacket button, except it had tiny wires coming off the back. He explained how the recording device worked and made me practice putting the jacket on and off until the button sat in exactly the right spot to pick up voices clearly. We tested it by having me walk around the room while he listened from his desk, adjusting the volume until he could hear me breathing even when I whispered. Then we moved on to the safe word, which Barry said needed to sound natural in conversation, so whoever I was meeting wouldn't realize I was calling for help. We settled on birthday candles because it made sense to mention on my actual birthday, and Barry made me practice working it into different sentences until it felt normal coming out of my mouth. After that, he pulled out a map of the area around Starfire and walked me through the extraction plan, showing me exactly where officers would be positioned and which direction I should run if things went bad. He made me repeat the whole plan 5 times, pointing to each position on the map and explaining what I'd do at each step, until I could recite it perfectly, even when he tested me by asking random questions to throw me off. 2 days later, Barry called to tell me Victor's lawyer had sent over a letter offering cooperation in exchange for reduced charges. Victor claimed he was just writing letters for money and had no idea anyone was planning to actually grab these girls, that he thought it was all just grief counseling stuff. Barry said Victor's story kept changing every time they talked to him, first saying he didn't know anything, then admitting he suspected something, then claiming he tried to stop it but was scared. I asked if we should deal with Victor now, but Barry said no. We'd handle him after we caught whoever was running the operation at Starfire, because Victor was small compared to them. He explained that Victor would probably end up testifying against the others to save himself, which made me feel sick, but I understood it was how these things worked. That night, I sat at my desk and pulled out a blank piece of paper, needing to write something just for myself that I'd never send to anyone. I started writing about Dad, about the real memories I had of him teaching me to ride a bike, and making pancakes on Saturday mornings, and how the fake letters had stolen years of my grief by making me think he was still somehow watching over me. Writing it all out helped me separate what was real from what Victor had manufactured, helped me see that my actual father would never have wanted me manipulated like this. The words came out messy and honest, nothing like the careful sentences in those fake letters, and when I finished, I felt lighter somehow. I folded the paper into an envelope, wrote "for after" on the front, and hid it in the back of my desk drawer behind old school papers where I'd find it when this was all over. The next afternoon, Rachel called and said she'd arranged video calls with 2 families of the missing girls, that they wanted to meet me and hear about what I'd found. The first call was with Amanda's mom, who looked tired in a way that went deeper than just lack of sleep. She thanked me for being brave enough to investigate when she'd spent 2 years hitting dead ends with police who'd written Amanda off as a runaway. I promised her we were going to find answers, that the operation at Starfire was finally getting exposed, and she started crying so hard she had to end the call. The second family was Paige's parents, both of them sitting together on their couch, and they asked detailed questions about the letters and the storage unit, and whether I thought their daughter might still be alive somewhere. I had to be honest that I didn't know, that we were still gathering evidence, but that every piece we found brought us closer to the truth. After the calls ended, I sat staring at my blank computer screen, feeling the weight of their hope pressing down on me, knowing I was probably their last real chance for closure. 3 days before my birthday, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. The message said there'd been a change of plans, that I should come to the loading entrance at the back of Starfire instead of the front door, and to make sure I came alone like the letter said. My hands shook as I forwarded the screenshot to Barry, who called me back within 5 minutes. He said the change actually worked better for police positioning because the loading area was more isolated, and they could set up closer without being spotted. The fact that they were texting me directly meant they were fully committed to this meeting happening, that they believed I was going to show up. Barry told me not to respond to the text, to just let them think I'd seen it and agreed, and I spent the rest of the day trying not to think about what midnight would actually be like. The police station conference room felt too bright and too crowded when Barry brought in the additional officers for the full briefing. I sat at the end of the long table while they discussed entry points and communication protocols, passing around photos of the Starfire building and marking up maps with different colored pens. Someone asked about backup plans if I couldn't get to the extraction point, and another officer explained the secondary positions they'd have ready. They talked about me like I was part of the operation, rather than just some scared kid, going over arrest procedures and evidence collection while I tried to focus on breathing slowly. One of the younger officers looked at me and asked if I was sure I wanted to go through with this, if I understood the risks. And I said yes, because every time I closed my eyes, I saw Paige and Amanda and the others, who didn't get a chance to stop this from happening to them. The night before my birthday, Rachel showed up at my house with a bag full of supplies for what she called grounding exercises. We sat on my bedroom floor, and she taught me techniques for staying calm when I felt scared, like focusing on 5 things I could see, and 4 things I could feel I could touch, and 3 things I could hear. She made me practice breathing patterns that would keep my heart rate steady, and we went through different scenarios where I might feel panicked, and what I could do to center myself. Rachel kept reminding me that I could call the whole thing off at any point, that my safety mattered more than catching anyone, and I appreciated her saying it even though I knew I wasn't backing out. She stayed for 2 hours, going through everything until I felt more prepared, and when she left, she hugged me and said she'd be monitoring everything from the command vehicle. On my birthday morning, Mom made my favorite breakfast without saying anything about tonight's plan. She set down a plate of French toast and scrambled eggs, acting like it was just a normal birthday, and then pulled out a small wrapped box. Inside was a delicate silver necklace that had belonged to my grandmother, and Mom's hands shook as she helped me put it on. She told me she loved me, and that she was proud of how strong I'd become, and I felt the necklace settle against my chest where the wire would be hidden later. The weight of it felt like a reminder of actual family love versus the manufactured comfort of Victor's fake letters, something real I could hold on to when things got scary. At 10 p.m., Barry called me down to the station for the final briefing. He checked the wire one more time, making sure the button was secure and the audio was coming through clear, and then made me promise to put my safety above getting evidence. Jackson was waiting outside the briefing room and gave me a tight hug, making me swear to text him the second it was over, so he'd know I was okay. Mom stood next to Barry looking like she might throw up, but she squeezed my hand hard and said she was proud of me for being brave enough to do this. Everyone kept saying I could still back out, that no one would blame me, but I shook my head because we'd come too far to stop now. At 11:45 p.m., I drove toward Starfire with my headlights cutting through the darkness and an unmarked police car following far enough back that I could barely see it. The building came into view looking dark except for a single light over the loading entrance, exactly where the text had said to meet. I parked in the spot they'd designated, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles went white, and pulled out my phone to text Barry. I typed "I'm here" and hit send, then sat waiting in the silence with my heart pounding so hard against my ribs that I worried the wire would pick up every beat. The clock on my dashboard switched to 11:58, and I watched the seconds tick by while my breath fogged up the windshield. At exactly midnight, a figure stepped out from the shadows near the loading entrance, and I recognized Victor's walk before I could even see his face clearly. He moved toward my car with his hands in his pockets, looking relaxed and friendly, like he was just meeting me for coffee instead of trying to lure me into a building where girls had disappeared. I opened my car door because that was the plan, and stood up on shaking legs while Victor smiled at me with that same warm expression he'd used my entire life. He started talking about how proud my dad would be of me for being so brave, and how special this night was going to be. His voice had that caring tone that used to make me feel safe when I was little, and now it just made my skin crawl knowing what he really was. I managed to say something about being nervous and excited, which was what Barry told me to say, and Victor nodded like he understood completely. He kept going on about my dad and how much he loved me, and I had to focus on breathing steady, so the wire would pick up his words clearly. Then the door behind Victor opened and a woman walked out into the light wearing nice clothes and a smile that looked painted on her face. She introduced herself as Alyssa Harrington, and said she was here to help facilitate my reunion with my father. Her smile stayed frozen in place while her eyes moved over me like she was checking that I came alone, and I felt my stomach twist. Alyssa gestured toward the door and explained that we needed to go inside for privacy, because this was such a special moment. She used this soft voice that probably worked on other girls, but I could hear the push behind it. I started asking questions like Barry coached me to do and worked in phrases about wanting to understand what would happen next. Alyssa answered smoothly, but I noticed her smile got a little tighter each time I asked something new. Victor tried to help by telling me more stories about my dad and how he used to talk about me all the time. I stalled for another minute by saying I needed to grab my phone from the car, and Alyssa's hand shot out toward my arm. I stepped back automatically and said I just wanted to wait a minute because I was feeling nervous. Victor moved closer, trying to reassure me with another fake story about how my dad used to get nervous too. Alyssa's smile changed, and I watched her eyes go cold, while she calculated whether to keep playing nice or push harder. The patience in her expression looked predatory now, like she was deciding the best way to corner me, and I knew Barry had been right about everything. I was about to work in the safe word when bright lights suddenly flooded the entire parking lot from every direction. Barry's voice came over a loudspeaker telling everyone to freeze and stay exactly where they were. Alyssa's face transformed in an instant from fake warmth to pure fury, and she spun around trying to run back into the building. 2 officers came out of nowhere and tackled her right at the door while she fought and screamed. Victor just stood there with his hands going up in the air, looking completely defeated, like he knew this was always going to be how it ended. More police cars pulled into the lot with lights flashing and officers jumping out, moving fast and organized. I stayed next to my car like Barry told me to and watched everything happen, feeling like I might throw up from the adrenaline. Officers emerged from inside the building, bringing out another man in handcuffs who I'd never seen before in my life. He must have been waiting inside for them to bring me in, and I felt sick thinking about what would have happened if I'd actually gone in there alone. Barry walked over to my car and told me to stay put while they processed the scene, and his voice was calm and professional. I sat back down in the driver's seat, shaking all over while officers moved around taking photos and talking into radios. Victor stood with his hands cuffed behind his back, staring at the ground, and Alyssa was screaming something at the officers holding her. It was over, and I was safe, and they were all in handcuffs, and I couldn't quite believe it was real. Victor's phone was lying smashed on the ground near where he'd been standing, and Barry came over to look at it. He said Victor might have dropped it on purpose to destroy evidence, but they bagged it anyway along with everything else. They also took Alyssa's phone and some paperwork she'd been carrying in a folder. An officer came over with a tablet, and I gave my full statement right there in the parking lot describing everything that happened. My voice came out steadier than I expected now that the immediate danger was gone, and I could focus on getting every detail recorded. The officer asked me specific questions about what Victor and Alyssa said, and I repeated their words as exactly as I could remember them. By the time we finished my statement, it was almost 2 a.m., and Barry said I could go home. Mom was waiting in the command vehicle, and she practically ran over to hug me, so tight I could barely breathe. We drove home in silence because there weren't really words for what had just happened. When we got home at 3 a.m., we just sat on the couch together, not talking, while I tried to process everything. My phone buzzed with a text from Jackson asking if I was okay, and I sent back a thumbs up because I didn't have the energy for actual words yet. Rachel called a few minutes later to check in and said she was so proud of me, and we scheduled a follow-up appointment for tomorrow afternoon. I fell asleep right there on the couch with Mom's arm around me, and for the first time in weeks, I actually felt safe. The next morning, my phone rang and I saw Barry's name on the screen. He told me that Victor had surrendered through his lawyer during the night, and was cooperating fully now that he was facing serious charges. Victor admitted he knew the letters were part of a grooming operation, but he'd convinced himself he was just helping grieving families cope with loss. His excuses made me feel sick, but Barry said the cooperation meant they could build a much stronger case against everyone involved. Within 48 hours, the DA filed formal charges against Victor and Alyssa for conspiracy to commit kidnapping. Additional charges were pending as the investigation continued into the full scope of the operation. The judge set really high bail amounts and ordered GPS monitoring for Victor, along with no contact orders protecting me and all the other families. I saw the charges listed in the newspaper the next day, and reading them in print made everything feel official and real in a way it hadn't before. Barry called again to tell me they'd gotten warrants to search additional storage units and the main offices at the building. The search teams found personal belongings that had belonged to 2 of the missing girls, and I felt my chest get tight. Barry said he was calling each family personally to tell them about the discoveries. I couldn't imagine how devastating and relieving that news must be for them getting confirmation after years of not knowing. At least now they had some answers and could start working toward closure, instead of spending the rest of their lives wondering what happened to their daughters. A few days later, Barry called to tell me that Alyssa's lawyer had reached out about a possible plea deal. He explained that she was offering to provide information about the full operation in exchange for a reduced sentence, and the DA was considering it because these kinds of deals were pretty common in big cases. I sat on my bed listening to him explain how her cooperation could help us understand the complete scope of what was happening, and maybe identify other people involved. Part of me hated the idea of her getting any kind of deal after what she tried to do, but another part wanted answers about what happened to those missing girls. Barry said the DA would keep me updated on any decisions, and reminded me that my input mattered in the process. I thanked him and hung up feeling conflicted about the whole thing. Going back to the school that week was weird. Rumors were flying everywhere about why I'd missed my birthday, and why police had been at some building outside town. I could hear whispers in the hallways and feel people staring at me between classes. Jackson stuck close and kept telling people to mind their own business whenever someone got too nosy. My English teacher pulled me aside after class to say I could have extensions on any assignments I needed, and she didn't push when I said I'd been dealing with some family stuff. I appreciated that she didn't ask for details. By lunch, I was exhausted from all the attention and just wanted to go home. Rachel had given me a list of therapists who specialized in trauma, and I picked one whose office was in a completely different part of town, with no connection to Starfire or any grief counseling networks. Her name was Dr. Martinez, and her office felt safe the second I walked in. The walls were painted a calm blue color, and she had comfortable chairs instead of a weird couch. She didn't push me to talk about anything before I was ready, just asked basic questions about what I was hoping to get from therapy. I told her I needed help processing everything that happened without feeling judged, and she nodded like that made perfect sense. Having a place to go where I could work through stuff without pressure helped more than I expected. Mom and I finally had a real conversation about everything a few days after that first therapy session. We sat at the kitchen table with coffee, and I apologized for shutting her out and not trusting her with what I was discovering. She apologized for not believing me sooner, and said she'd been so scared of losing me that she couldn't think clearly. We agreed to be more honest with each other going forward instead of hiding things or making assumptions. She admitted that treating me like a kid who needed protection had probably made things worse, and I said I should have given her more chances to help. Our relationship felt different after that talk, more like we were equals than just parent and child. It wasn't perfect, but it was definitely better than before. Rachel called me in for a meeting at her office to go over some legal documents. The court had issued a protection order that covered me and all the other connected families, with specific rules about contact and how close Victor or Alyssa could get to any of us. She walked me through what the order meant in practical terms, like what to do if I saw either of them somewhere, or if they tried to contact me through someone else. We updated my safety plan for daily life now that the immediate danger was over, but the legal stuff was still ongoing. Having the protection on paper made me feel more secure, even though I knew they were both still in custody. Rachel made copies of everything for me to keep, and said to call her immediately if anything felt off. 2 weeks after my birthday, Zoe published a detailed article about the whole Starfire operation. I read it online, and she'd done an amazing job focusing on how the system failed and what needed to change to protect other families. She interviewed me anonymously so nobody could identify me, and she quoted from some of the letters without using any names. The article was really well written and explained how predatory grief counseling worked without making it sound sensational. Within a few days of publication, the state licensing board announced they were investigating Starfire and would be conducting a full review of their practices. By the end of that week, they announced the center's permanent closure and revoked all their licenses. Reading that news made me feel like something good was finally coming from all this nightmare. The preliminary hearing happened about a month later, and I had to testify about the letters, finding the storage unit, and what happened at the midnight meeting. I sat in the witness box trying to keep my voice steady while Alyssa's lawyer asked me questions designed to make it seem like I was never in real danger. He kept suggesting that maybe I'd misunderstood the situation or overreacted to what was basically grief counseling. The judge interrupted him twice to say the questions weren't appropriate, and I could tell she wasn't buying his defense strategy at all. After I finished testifying, Barry told me I'd done great, and that all the charges were being bound over for trial. He mentioned that plea negotiations were continuing behind the scenes, though, so there might not actually be a trial. Victor's plea deal went through first a few weeks later. Barry called to tell me that Victor was getting 5 years in prison plus probation for his role in the conspiracy. It didn't feel like nearly enough for 12 years of lies and helping endanger multiple girls, but Barry explained it was actually a significant sentence for this type of crime. The important part was that Victor would be on the registry and wouldn't be able to work with vulnerable people ever again. I asked Barry if 5 years was really justice, and he said sometimes the legal system doesn't give us the satisfaction we want, but at least there was accountability. I tried to accept that even though part of me wanted Victor to face more consequences. Alyssa fought the charges longer, but eventually accepted a plea deal when the evidence became too strong to ignore. Barry told me she was getting 8 years in prison, and her cooperation had led to identifying 2 more people involved in the operation. Those arrests happened quietly without much media attention, but Barry said it meant the whole network was finally being taken apart piece by piece. He explained that Alyssa's information helped them understand how the operation recruited girls and what happened to some of them. I didn't ask for specific details because I wasn't sure I could handle knowing everything yet. About a week after Alyssa's sentencing, I got a letter forwarded through Rachel from one of the other families. The mother wrote to thank me for being brave enough to investigate and report what I found. She explained that her daughter's case was reopened with new evidence from the Starfire investigation, and they finally had real hope for answers after years of not knowing. Reading her words made me cry, but in a good way, like all the fear and stress had actually been worth something. She said her family would be forever grateful that I didn't just ignore the weird letters, and that my actions might bring them closure. I folded the letter carefully and put it in my desk drawer next to the one I'd written to myself about Dad. A few weeks later, Natasha texted asking if I wanted to meet for coffee, and I drove to the cafe near her bookstore feeling nervous, but also relieved to talk to someone who understood. She looked different from the first time I saw her, less scared somehow, and we sat in a corner booth away from other people. She told me she'd started seeing a therapist who specialized in manipulation and predatory behavior, and for the first time she was actually processing what almost happened instead of just trying to forget it. I shared that I was doing the same thing with my new therapist, and we talked about how weird it felt to grieve the fake version of our dads while also remembering the real ones. Natasha brought up the idea of starting a support group for people who'd been through predatory grief counseling, but we both agreed we needed to heal more first before we could help others. Just knowing I wasn't alone in this experience made me feel less broken, like maybe what happened to us wasn't our fault after all. We exchanged numbers and promised to check in regularly, and when I left the cafe, I felt lighter than I had in months. 3 months after my birthday, Rachel called asking if I wanted to volunteer at her victim advocacy organization, and I said yes before really thinking about it. She explained I'd be answering phones and doing basic office work, nothing that would put me in direct contact with active cases or re-traumatize me. I started working there a few hours a week after school, filing paperwork and updating databases, and occasionally talking to people who called the helpline. Rachel was careful to give me tasks that felt useful without being overwhelming, and she checked in constantly to make sure I was handling everything okay. The work gave me a sense of purpose I hadn't felt since before all this started, like I was turning something horrible into something that might actually help people. One afternoon, I answered a call from a mom whose daughter was getting weird letters, and I was able to walk her through exactly what to do and who to contact. After I hung up, Rachel told me I'd probably just saved that girl from going through what I did, and I realized this was what I wanted to do with my life. I started making plans for college applications with my guidance counselor, focusing on criminal justice programs and schools with strong victim advocacy tracks. She helped me write an essay about resilience and investigating the truth, without making my trauma into some kind of inspiration story or exploiting what I went through. The essay talked about learning to trust my instincts and taking action when something felt wrong, and how those skills would help me in whatever career I chose. I actually felt excited reading through college websites and imagining myself studying criminology or legal advocacy, like I had a real future instead of just trying to survive each day. My guidance counselor said my essay was one of the strongest she'd read, and she thought I had a good shot at getting into competitive programs. The experience changed me for sure, but it didn't break me the way whoever ran Starfire probably hoped it would. Mom and I started developing new traditions that had nothing to do with the fake letters or manufactured memories of Dad. We began taking Sunday morning walks around the neighborhood, just talking about normal stuff like school and her work, and what we wanted to cook for dinner. Twice a week we made dinner together, trying new recipes and listening to music and actually communicating instead of dancing around difficult topics. She told me stories about Dad that were real, things I'd forgotten or never knew, and I shared memories from when I was little that she'd never heard my perspective on. We were rebuilding trust and connection based on honest communication, instead of the false comfort those letters provided for 12 years. Our relationship felt healthier now than it had been since Dad died, like we were finally grieving together as a real family, instead of me grieving alone with fake words. Mom admitted she'd relied on those letters too much, using them as a way to avoid dealing with her own pain, and I understood because I'd done the same thing. The State Attorney General's office announced a broader investigation into grief counseling fraud after Zoe's article got picked up by bigger news outlets. They released a statement about new regulations for the industry, including background checks for counselors and oversight of organizations that work with grieving families. Zoe sent me the press release, and I read through all the new rules they were implementing, realizing our case had become the catalyst for systemic change. The regulations would require regular audits of grief counseling centers and mandatory reporting of any suspicious patterns or behaviors. Knowing that something good was coming from this nightmare helped me process the trauma better, like all the fear and investigation and testimony had actually protected other families. I saved the press release in the same folder as the letter from the other mother, proof that speaking up had mattered even when I was terrified. 6 months after my birthday, Barry called to tell me the last person connected to the Starfire operation had accepted a plea deal. His voice sounded relieved as he explained that all cases were now resolved. Everyone was being held accountable and the investigation was officially closed. I thanked him for believing me from the very start and for keeping me safe through the whole controlled meeting operation. He said I'd done the hard part by being brave enough to investigate when something felt wrong and reporting what I found instead of ignoring it. We talked for a few more minutes about how the case would be used in training for other detectives, and he mentioned he'd probably never forget working with me. After we hung up, I sat in my room feeling like a chapter was actually ending. Not in some dramatic way, but just in the quiet knowledge that it was finally over. I got accepted to 3 universities with strong criminal justice programs and spent a week comparing their victim advocacy tracks and internship opportunities. One school stood out because they had partnerships with legal aid organizations and a specialized program in trauma-informed victim services. I called Jackson to tell him my decision, and he got excited because he'd just been accepted to their cybersecurity program. We started making plans to room near each other, looking at apartment listings and talking about finally living somewhere new. Having a friend who knew everything I'd gone through and still saw me as a normal person meant everything. Someone I could be completely honest with without having to hide or explain. We made lists of things we'd need for our apartments, and started a group chat with Natasha about visiting each other once we all got settled. The future felt real and possible instead of scary and uncertain. On what would have been Dad's birthday, I sat down and wrote him a real letter about who I'd become and what I'd survived. I told him about the fake letters and how I'd uncovered a predatory operation, about meeting Natasha and working with Barry and testifying in court. I wrote about choosing to study victim advocacy and how I thought he would be proud of me for turning something horrible into a way to help people. The letter was honest about my anger at Victor and the people who'd used Dad's death to manipulate me, but also about the real memories I still had of him that no one could take away. I took the letter downstairs to our fireplace and burned it, watching the pages curl and turn to ash while Mom stood next to me. Letting go of the manufactured version of him felt like finally accepting that he was really gone, but keeping my real memories meant he wasn't completely lost. I'm sitting in Rachel's office for our regular check-in when she tells me about a new survivor who needs support, someone who experienced something similar with predatory grief counseling. I agree to talk to her when she's ready, knowing I can help guide someone else through this because I've been there. Rachel explains the girl is still pretty scared and might not be ready for a few weeks, but having a peer support person lined up will make a big difference. My phone buzzes with a text from Mom asking what I want for dinner, then another from Jackson sharing a meme about college stress, then one from Natasha saying she's planning a visit next month. I look at the messages and realize I'm not just surviving anymore. I'm actually building a real life surrounded by people who genuinely care about me. Rachel asks if I'm okay, and I tell her yeah, I really am, and for the first time in months, I completely mean it. Wow. What a journey Sophie went through, right? I'm just so glad she trusted her instincts and found people who believed in her. If this story resonated with you, I'd absolutely love a like. And subscribe if you want more incredible true stories, because honestly, sharing these with you all is the highlight of my week.